I'm the adopted daughter of the Whites. During the time when George was blind from a car accident, we had a one-night stand by accident. After giving birth to his child, I ended up leaving the child with the Whites and went abroad. George, clueless about who the mother of his son was, became a single dad. 5 years later, I returned to my home country and married him. People say I'm broad-minded and generous, willing to become a stepmom at a young age. They don't know, not even George knows to this day, that I'm actually the biological mom of his son, Evan. George's company's law department, at the coffee station during lunchtime. I'm standing there, making a coffee, listening to some coworkers chatting about their ultimate boss, our President George. 2 months ago, George started wearing a wedding ring on his finger. Our president got married and settled down suddenly. Why should anyone in high society announce to the world when they get married and have kids? It's just curiosity about what kind of woman could capture cold George's heart. Perhaps it was an arranged marriage. Anyway, back to the point. George's new wife stepped right into the role of a stepmom. The current president of the Whites, George, is the decisive leader of the group, only 27, quite young and accomplished. But everyone knows he already has a son who's around 5 years old. That little boy had once been brought to the company to find his dad. He's such a detailed replica of George, it's obvious they're father and son. If you do the math, George graduated from the top university in the country, and his son Evan was born the same year he finished his studies. Just after graduation, when George was so young, he became a father. The little boy has always been raised solely by George. The existence and identity of Evan's mom have always been a mystery. I overheard someone say, I'm more curious about who Evan's biological mom was back then. How could she manage to have George become a dad at just 20? Just as I was leaving the kitchen, the department manager called me, Joanna, head up with me for the meeting. It's been roughly 3 months since I returned to the country. Just a month after returning, I got married to George. It isn't an arranged marriage. I'm not only adopted by the Whites, but George's mom also really likes me. She insisted George marry me. At the company, we don't publicize our marriage due to professional boundaries, so almost nobody knows I'm George's wife. I went up for the meeting. In the spacious, bright conference room, I stood there in high heels, presenting a risk assessment report. Seated at the head of the conference table, impeccably dressed in a suit, was George, a man so handsome and dignified. A subtle look from him revealed an aura of aloofness and authority that made you hesitate to approach or offend him. His eyes didn't linger on me, we acted like strangers. Yet, after work, sitting in the Maybach driving out from the company's underground parking garage, George and I sat together in the back seat. When we got back home, Evan wasn't around. I asked the butler, "Where's the kid?" George, while handing his suit jacket to the butler, replied softly, "Mom took him to the old house. He won't be back tonight." Not coming back, huh? In the deep of the night, after my bath, I emerged from the bathroom. George, with his tall frame, was lounging on the bed. Different from his impeccable work image, his hair was half wet, one leg slightly bent, lazily poised. He wore a finely crafted dark home outfit, the top button undone. Under the thin fabric lay the firm physique of a mature man. During the day, George's suit attire exudes such seriousness that one almost dares not gaze too long, fearing to taint it. I used to think so too, but after marrying for 2 months, I realized that George has desires. In fact, he takes the lead. Since we're married now, we've done everything couples do. He glanced at me as if to ask whether my mom's been pushing you to have a child recently. My silence spoke volumes. George directly stated, "It's your body, your decision. If you wish to have a child, I'm fully supportive. If not, I'll handle Mom and Dad." We had never openly discussed such topics before. Years ago, I was young, and when visiting the Whites on weekends, what we discussed was merely about me keeping up with university courses. Suddenly, George's inquiry this time, just like the previous conversation, threw me off guard. I felt my cheeks heat up. Thinking of Evan, I declined, "Not now." "All right," George agreed before getting a condom. When he was particularly forceful, I tilted my head up, biting my lip, but couldn't help quietly calling out habitually, "Brother. No more, okay?" George paused as he leaned over me, his forehead pressed tightly against my damp neck and shoulder, lips nibbling. He raised his head, came closer to kiss my lips, and softly, he murmured my name, Joanna, as if he was savoring it in his mouth. "Don't call me that. It makes me feel like I'm committing a crime." Perhaps because of the talk about children tonight, afterward, as George rose to tidy up, he told me, "You don't have to see yourself as a stepmom. If you don't like Evan or get along with him, don't force yourself." I instinctively rebutted, "I like Evan." "Oh." Even George found it surprising. I opened my weary eyes, cautiously inquiring, "He's adorable. Perhaps someday, his real mom might regret. To me, she's just someone who gave Evan life." Before I could finish, George interrupted. Even in the dim darkness, I sensed the oppressive irritation emanating from the man beside me. George, always composed and calm, seldom showed such emotion. The truth about Evan's birth mom seemed to be his taboo. "If the woman who calculated against me appears before me, no matter who she is, it'll be a fate worse than death for her," George warned slowly, exuding a chilling resolve. In middle school, when my family went bankrupt, and my parents fled abroad, leaving me behind, my mom's friend, George's mother, adopted me. George was a year older than me. By the time of his car accident, I had already been calling him brother for 7 years. The accident wasn't severe, but it resulted in a rare condition. The doctor explained it as nerve compression causing temporary blindness. However, after 6 months of efforts, there was no improvement. George grew more withdrawn and moody, and the entire city gossiped about the White's future heir becoming blind. Unwilling to accept reality, George continued to attend social events, only to be drugged one night, something he knew nothing about. That night, I followed him into the restroom to check on him, and things spiraled from there. I got sick afterward, and the morning after pill was ineffective. Upon discovering my pregnancy, the White's parents, who raised me, almost begged me to keep the child. If George's condition didn't improve, this child would be their hope for the future. George's mom once asked him if he'd let me stay by his side, noting I was gentle and caring. But even blind, George's handsome features remained untouched. Despite being in a low state, his reply was firm: "Our original purpose in adopting her was never to groom her to be a submissive daughter-in-law. We've always treated her as our daughter. I've watched her grow up, she's more like a sister to me." About that night. Is the girl still alive? Astonishingly, George didn't know it was me that night. Even the Whites didn't dare reveal to him that I was the one bearing his child. While awaiting childbirth, I heard about a young, capable female eye doctor who had been dedicatedly treating George. Despite the risks, George trusted her for the crucial surgery. Thankfully, it had a successful outcome. Half a year after the surgery and George regaining his vision, before I flew abroad to continue my studies, though the doctor was young, she was still 7 years George's senior. The Whites disapproved, and they took 6-month-old Evan to his father. Upon learning of the child, the doctor quickly married someone else. No wonder George detests Evan's birth mother. She disrupted a relationship he deeply cherished. Years went by, and George was eventually willing to marry me, perhaps because pressure from Joanna had finally reached him. On the first night after our wedding, I called him brother. He insisted that since we were married, we should accept our roles. "I'm not celibate. I won't ignore my wife," he said. Evan was back early this morning. At breakfast, as I got closer, Evan interrupted, "Are you here to take my dad from me?" George stopped his slow eating, now possessing a father's authority. "What happened to the manners and conduct we taught you?" Evan, stubborn, remained silent, so George asked the butler to take him to school. I chased them outside and offered, "I'll do it." At the kindergarten, the little boy spoke, "If you think I'm in the way, Vivian and her mom have invited me to their place." I teased him, "Vivian someone you like?" "I just like her mom. She's a doctor, sometimes busier than Dad, yet she picks Vivian up from school every day. Later at work, I ran into the deputy director of the tech department. He said hello, and gossip spread fast. "Joanna, what's going on with you and Nathan?" He's the group's renowned foreign-educated talent. Even Wendy, the president's assistant, hadn't succeeded with him. I quickly denied and explained. Nathan did chase me during our overseas studies, but I didn't accept. At noon, I discreetly found time to go to George's office. George was busy with work, but upon my arrival, he summoned lunch. He joined me after addressing some matters, and as the atmosphere changed, he pulled me onto his lap, disregarding the creasing trousers. He brought his lips to mine, deeply kissing me. George never schemes. Down below, he lifted my delicate chiffon shirt, the hem rising from my neatly tucked skirt waistband. With his kiss, I half opened my eyes, relieved by the shut window curtains and recalling the locked office door, easing my nerves. I was almost weakened entirely by his touch. His longer, drawn-out affection enveloped me, guiding me slowly, before laying us down with his suit jacket over me. Leaning against his shoulder, he asks quietly, "Shall we use my resting room?" Impulsively, I bit into his neckline, leaving a faint mark. "George, we have meetings this afternoon, let's not overdo it." Stroking my side, newlyweds, it's natural to be close. Aware these roles weren't fully familiar to me, realizing our marriage turned these actions proper and lawful. It was my first time hearing George address me this way, a casual comment directed, "Is there a queue of people wanting to chase my wife here at work?" Referring to the earlier rumor about Nathan. He's someone I met while studying abroad. Understanding his misgiving, George relented, "Past's past, now we are married, I'll be good with you." Come late morning, I meant to ask George to leave work early for picking up Evan. George eventually agreed. At school, Evan didn't expect to see us both there. Leading Evan by hand was a woman whom I presumed to be Vivian's mom but didn't expect her surprise at meeting us, particularly George. She called him, "George, I'm Linda, the one who did your surgery. You remember me?" Unbeknownst to me, Vivian's mom was once the young doctor. Smiling, "You got married, huh? How serendipitous." Complimented, "Your wife suits your age and looks." Linda hadn't imagined encountering us, especially now asking George for a favor. "I just got divorced and faced difficulties soon after. The Whites promised me a tangible promise after your surgery. I postponed asking then. Can I request it now?" George remained unaffected, casual tones betraying nothing. Linda's issue seemed entirely alien. The urgency in Linda's voice didn't move him, though her plea reached depths of pity. Linda's regrets over past choices and hardships were palpable. Linda had come without warning in a moment of complication, now reopening doors to her past resolutions. George, befitting his bearing, had never been close or warmer than this meeting. My inherent observation reveals no imminent change in him. Linda glancingly eyes me as George introduces me as his wife. I hadn't anticipated Linda's connection with Evan. She was a stark relief from Evan's perceived fantasy about motherhood, strong but in plight. Returning home that evening with George, I bore lingering thoughts on George's mom's former confessions. Linda's charm, an undeniable allure to many. Her notable qualities, in hand with her affections over the time of George's poor health, were resuscitated through her closeness. Yet George's mother kept suspicions. George's revitalized sight, among countless other concerns, held a likelihood of Linda drawing close once more. Yet another woman, young and capable, invoked strategic defenses by George's parents coupled with discomfort for them, a continuation only fragment ally introduced previously. On the journey back, George's rare confidences reveal his thoughts. "Joanna, as my wife now, speak plainly with me. During the years of your absence, as a man of my temperament and youthful vigor, rest assured I touched no other woman." There was a gravity to his insinuation, leaving Evan under another's care. No other woman harbored room against his witnessed marital conformance involving Evan, curiosity arrested through finality beyond regular intentions. Reintroduction of said familiarity unperturbed and resolute, our iterations outnumbered. What repressed relationships seen expounding weathered vows better support secure grounding strengths poised to maintain stability. I recall my sporadic hesitation during the process of return, potentially unveiling my self-purported roles, observing choices reflecting back through Evan's inquiries among alternative relationships. The cessation from my period abroad to revelations realized now benefited wholly, embroiled through engagements to family, with George's uniform experiences devoid of indifference contrary to pre-perceived growth. Her identity shielded the unknown throughout. The roles left most credited responded reciprocally, requiring of understanding, enabling turn judgment ultimately resolved across the apparent emotional bridges encountered enduring alternatives. Characterized distinct from their previous framework, weathering specialization demonstrated through atypical accord singularly from family-entwined affirmations, then wisely bearing tangible manifestations interwoven exceptionally a shared conservatory prosperous endeavors trumpeting constancy assurance beyond the turbulent unrest expectations offered demonstrably projected within mutual life advancements visible entirely personal. Yet, Evan and I remained exclusively free, tethered into practice credentials resulting from familial confidence culminating now built onto integral observations enriched deliberately manifesting over expansive opportunities throughout determined attendance occasioned equally enduring peaceful outcomes. I'm the White's adopted daughter. During the time George went blind from his car accident, I ended up having a one-night stand with him. After having his child, I left the baby with the Whites under their arrangement and moved abroad. George became a single dad without even knowing who the mother of his son is. 5 years later, I came back to the country and married him. People say I have a big heart, being so young and willing to be a stepmom. But what they don't know, not even George himself, is that I'm actually Evan's birth mom. At George's company's legal department, it's lunchtime in the break room. I'm standing off to the side making coffee. I overhear some coworkers discussing our boss, the CEO George. George put a wedding ring on his finger 2 months ago. Did our CEO suddenly go and get married? Why would anyone notify you about who gets married or has a kid in a wealthy family anyway? It's just curiosity. They haven't announced it to the public. What kind of woman could win over someone as cold as George? Maybe it's a business marriage. But speaking of which, George's newlywed wife became a stepmom right from the start. Their current CEO George, who's sharp and impressive, is only 27. Quite the accomplished young man. But everyone knows he already has a son, around 5 years old. The little boy had once been brought to the company to see his dad. The kid looks just like George, obviously his biological son. Calculating the timeline, George graduated from the top domestic university. His son Evan was born the same year he completed his studies. Right after school, at a very young age, George became a dad. The little boy has been raised solely by George. The child's mother's identity has always been a mystery. I hear someone among them say, instead of being curious about George's new wife, I'm more curious about what kind of woman the little guy's mom is. How did she get George to be a dad at such a young age? Just as I leave the break room, the department manager calls me. Joanna, come upstairs for a meeting with me. I returned to the country about 3 months ago. A month after returning, George and I got married. It wasn't arranged. I've been adopted by the Whites, and George's mother really likes me. She insisted George marry me. In the company, to keep work and personal life separate, hardly anyone knows George and I are married. Going into the meeting. In the spacious and bright conference room, I'm standing at the front in heels, giving a risk assessment report. Seated at the head of the table is a man in a perfectly tailored suit. He looks extremely handsome and sophisticated. With just a glance, he emits a distant aura that makes people hesitate to get close or offend him. His gaze doesn't linger much on me, as if we don't really know each other. But after work, we both sit in the back of the Maybach driving out of the company's underground garage. Back at home, Evan isn't there. I ask the butler, where's the kid? George, handing over his suit jacket to the butler, quietly replies, Mom took him to the old house. He's not coming back tonight. In the late-night bedroom, I come out of the bathroom after a shower. George, tall and slender, is leaning against the headboard. Unlike his impeccable image at work, his hair is half dry, one long leg slightly bent, looking relaxed. He's in a finely made dark loungewear, with the top button undone. Under the thin fabric, you can see his mature and solid physique. During the day in his suit, George is so proper and restrained that people fear disrespecting him with even a glance. His usually cold face seems incapable of expressing desire. I used to think so, too, but after 2 months of marriage, I've realized George does have desires. He's often the one taking the lead. Now that we're married, we've done things couples do. He glances at me, putting the tablet he was holding on the bedside table. In bed, leaning over me, he's not doing anything at first, just asking. Has Mom been pestering you about having a child lately? My silence speaks for itself. George straightforwardly says, it's your body, your decision. If you want a child, I'll fully cooperate. If not, I'll handle my parents. We've never discussed this topic so directly. Years ago, I was young. When I'd visit the Whites on weekends, George would ask if I was keeping up with my college courses. Now, suddenly, he's asking if I want to have a child with him. The switch is too big for me to adjust. My face gets warm, thinking of Evan, and I decline. I'm not ready yet. Okay. George gets up to get a condom. When he's particularly forceful, I tilt my head back, biting my lip, and can't help but softly call out that familiar name. Brother. Can we stop? George pauses, still leaning over, his forehead against my damp neck, his lips brushing lightly. He raises his head, kisses my lips, and in a deep voice, murmurs my name, Joanna. As if savoring it. Don't call me that, makes me feel like I'm committing a crime. Maybe because we talked about kids tonight, afterward, as George gets up to clean up, he tells me. You don't need to see yourself as a stepmom. If you don't like Evan or don't get along, there's no need to force it. I almost instinctively reply, I like Evan. Oh. Even George seems surprised. I open my tired eyes a bit, cautiously asking George, he's really cute, maybe his mother will regret. In my view, she just gave Evan life. I hadn't even finished talking when George interrupted me. Even in the dimness, I could sense the tension and frustration radiating from the man beside me. This was rare for George, who was usually calm and composed. Evan's biological mother, surprisingly, was his taboo. Trying to mess with and manipulate the child I gave birth to. George spoke slowly, I don't care who she is. She must never appear in front of me again. If I find her, dead or alive, she'll wish she was. Back in middle school, my family went bankrupt. My parents left me and fled abroad. My mom's friend, George's mom, took me in with the George. George was a year older, and until his car accident, I had called him brother for 7 years. The accident wasn't severe, but he encountered a rare complication. Doctors said his nerves were compressed, causing temporary blindness. Even after 6 months of treatment, his sight didn't return. George grew increasingly cold and temperamental. The whole city gossiped that the future heir of the George was blind. He wouldn't accept reality. At a party he attended despite his condition, someone drugged him. Unknown to him, the George parents and I were concerned and attended as well. Sensing something was off, I went to check on him. He pinned me down. After George's first time with me, I fell sick with a fever for 2 days. The morning after pills were thrown up. When I found out I was pregnant, the Whites' parents nearly begged me. If George never recovered, this child would be their future hope. George's mom would ask him, Joanna is kind and caring, what about letting her stay with you? Even without sight, George was still exceptionally attractive. During that time, despite his bad state, he firmly replied, Mom, we never took her in to make her your obedient daughter-in-law. We raised her as a daughter. I see her as a sister. That night, the girl. Did she survive? George didn't know that night it was me. He only saw me as a sister, and the White's parents didn't dare let him know that person he considered a sister was having his child. Later, while I was pregnant, I heard of a young, talented female eye doctor who spent the past 6 months meticulously treating George. He finally trusted her for the most complex and risky surgery. Luckily, it was successful. Half a year after George regained his sight, I had flown abroad to continue my studies. Back then, even if she was young, the doctor was 7 years George's senior. The White's parents disapproved and brought infant Evan before George. Learning George had a kid, the doctor soon married someone else. No wonder George loathes the child's birth mother, having ruined a past relationship. Years later, when Joanna pressured us, George finally agreed to marry me. On our wedding night, I called him brother. He said now that we were married, he'd accept our new roles. He's not a celibate man, he wouldn't ignore his wife. Evan returned early the next morning. At the breakfast table, as I grew closer to him, the boy cut in, "Are you here to take my dad away?" "I'm sorry." George's voice was filled with paternal authority. "Where are your manners and upbringing?" Defiantly, Evan remained silent as George ordered the housekeeper to take him to school. Outside, I insisted on taking him myself. At the kindergarten gate, the boy finally spoke. "If I'm bothersome, Vivian and her mom invited me to stay with them." I joked, "Vivian's a girl you like?" He quietly replied, "I just like her mom. She's a doctor, busier than dad, yet she picks her up every day." At the company, I ran into the VP of Tech. He greeted me, and gossip spread fast among colleagues. "Joanna, what's going on with you and Nathan? He's an accomplished overseas returnee." Even Wendy, the CEO's top aide, couldn't snag him. I quickly denied and explained. "Nathan pursued me when I studied abroad, but I didn't accept." At lunch, I quietly slipped to George's office. George was busy but ordered food when he saw me. After eating, the mood shifted. Sure enough, he pulled me into his lap, not minding the wrinkling of his dress pants. He pressed his lips to mine. George wasn't just teasing. His hand slipped under my blouse, tugging it free from my skirt. My eyes flitted open briefly, noting the drawn curtains and locked door, calming my nerves. By the end, I was practically jelly in his hands. George nibbled my lips gently before draping his suit jacket over me. I rested on his shoulder, and he softly asked, "To my resting room?" I feigned a bite on his neck, reminding, "We both have meetings later, don't push it." George gently caressed my waist. Newly married, anything I do with my wife feels totally natural and justified. I still haven't fully adjusted to the change in my relationship status. Somehow, we ended up as a legally recognized married couple. This was the first time I heard George call me that. He casually asked, "So, are there a lot of guys lining up at work trying to get with my wife?" George must have heard about Nathan. Nathan was just a senior I met while studying abroad. George paused for a moment and then asked, "Did you meet anyone else during those years abroad?" I didn't really get what he was implying. "I know I don't really have the right to question you." George spoke slowly, "I don't have any hang-ups about first times. But I would like to know, Joanna, who was your first?" Hearing this, I felt like my blood turned to ice for a second. Honestly, I didn't know how to respond. I tried dating overseas, but later realized I couldn't focus on romance. After returning home, interactions between men and women lost their awkwardness. Our wedding night was smooth and effortless. I know he's not bothered, it's just a misunderstanding. But I've only ever been with George. How do I tell him that his question's answer is actually him, from 5 years ago? He hates someone so much that he wants them to suffer, but that person is me. Forget it. George was the first to change his mind. His expression turned rational and calm. He absently rearranged his collar that I had unbuttoned. "Whatever happened before doesn't matter. We're married now. Let's make things work." The reason I came to see George during lunch was to ask if he could leave work early tonight so we could pick up Evan from kindergarten together. George ultimately agreed. Evan was pretty surprised to see George and me after school. He was holding hands with a woman, who also held a little girl's hand. I guessed she must be Vivian's mom that Evan mentioned. But I didn't expect the little girl's mom to be even more surprised to see us. George. She called out to George first. I'm Linda. I did that surgery on you back in the day. You remember me, right? I didn't expect Vivian's mom to be the doctor from back then. Noticing me, George introduced me, my newlywed wife. Linda chuckled, You're married now? What a coincidence. Then she complimented, Your wife matches you well in age and looks. She was about to leave with her daughter but suddenly returned. She quickly approached George and said, George, it's actually not such a coincidence. I just got divorced recently. Now I'm having some trouble. The George family promised me a favor after your successful surgery, which I never requested. Can I ask for it now? George's usual calm demeanor made it hard to read his thoughts at the moment. His phone suddenly rang, interrupting Linda. It seemed like an important call because George, who usually maintains his manners, had to say, Sorry. He took out his phone to answer it first. I was close enough to hear the call clearly. George, we finally have some leads on the person you've been asking me to find. George responded calmly, You found them? George, this time you won't be disappointed. He didn't continue the conversation. When George hung up, Linda spoke again. My ex-husband and I ended things badly. Linda showed her bruised arm. I'm a doctor. He threatened to break my hands. The mother and daughter looked pitiful, arousing empathy. Please, George, can you help my daughter and me find some protection? Her daughter looked cautiously at George. Linda married after Evan was about 6 months old, so her daughter should be at least 1.5 years younger than Evan. Yet, the two kids didn't look that different in age. Linda voluntarily confessed to George, The child isn't my ex-husband's. I'm most afraid of her getting hurt. The George family is known for keeping their promises, so if George wants to help, it's not a big deal for him. But towards Linda, George seemed particularly indifferent today. Miss Linda, the police and a lawyer would be more useful than I am. On the way back, I recalled something George's mom had told me. Linda was quite capable and charming back in the day. She was almost irresistible to men. But she only had eyes for George, who was much younger than her. And during George's blindness, Linda was his attending doctor, giving him special care and attention, more than others. Most importantly, she gave him the chance to see again. If not stopped, George would find it hard to resist a woman like her. That's when George's mom secretly set conditions to send Linda away from George. Linda was proud and upset upon learning George had a child. In the end, she thought she had misjudged him, believing he was different from other men. Having a son out of wedlock, she thought he was hypocritically promiscuous. Neither explained or cleared the misunderstanding, leaving things tense. Even when Linda came forward today, George didn't stay long. The sky outside the window darkened, George's silhouette was calm. George broke the silence, Joanna, you're my wife now. As a couple, we can be straightforward. During the years you were gone, I was a young man full of energy. I'm not going to say I had no desires. But even so, I can tell you clearly, I haven't been with another woman. No wonder George made Evan sit in another car with his assistant after he said that. My life isn't that exciting yet. He outright declared, there's no way Linda's daughter is mine. He left no room for doubt or misunderstanding in my mind. While George isn't old-fashioned or overly strict, he doesn't exactly have a passion for being a dad either. I trust what he said at noon. Now that he's chosen to get married, regardless of the past, he genuinely intends to spend a good life with me. Usually, he's in the bedroom early at night, but tonight he's unusually working late in the study. When I brought him some fruit, I saw his almost perfectly proportioned figure standing at the window. George was on the phone. Arrange a yacht for me. Though his tone was calm, it seemed chilled by the night air outside the window. I don't need to know exactly who she is or her name. I have no interest in finding out early. Just bring her straight to the boat when the time comes. George heard a noise behind him and turned to see me. He hung up the phone and said, "Honey." Seeing that I was only wearing a thin nightgown, George took my hand. "Why are you so cold?" He pulled me into the study, holding me close against his chest. I pretended not to know. "Who were you just talking to?" George kissed my lips. "I don't want to lie to you. I found out the truth from back then." My eyelashes trembled slightly. "And then? Are you going to make Evan's birth mother pay a huge price?" George buried his face in my neck, taking a deep breath. "Don't stop me." It was late at night when there was a knock at the study door. "Dad." It was Evan. George got up from holding me. Because I was in a spaghetti-strap nightgown, he only opened the door halfway, blocking me behind it. George was back to his usual calm self. As a father, he stood towering over Evan in front of him. Evan asked him, "It's the weekend tomorrow. Can I go see Linda and Vivian?" George answered simply, even calmly, "Sure." "Dad, what about you? If you don't let Joanna know, can you come with me to protect them?" I quickly heard George's reply. His voice still steady, "I can't." He spoke to the kids slowly, "You go by yourself. I won't stop you. Once you're there, you can stay with them forever and live with them from now on. But you'll never need to come back to this house again. You choose." It was clear that George was teaching his son a lesson. He wasn't going to indulge him in this matter. "You and I have the closest blood relation." I stood next to George as he told Evan, "And Joanna is my wife, and she and I have the closest relationship in the world too." He wasn't accusing but was clearly asking and telling the child, "Isn't it you who's in the wrong? She's always been genuinely caring for and taking care of you, and you said you hate her. Someone else just plays with you a few times, and you choose to be close to someone else's mom. Isn't she really your family? Won't she be sad?" George finally told him to think it through. After Evan left, George pressed a finger against the corner of his eye. I noticed his movement. The family doctor always warns him to keep an eye on old injuries. "Is your eye bothering you?" George shook his head, just a bit tired. He added, "Children haven't fully developed the ability to tell right from wrong. Their actions ultimately reflect their parents' attitudes and values. I will teach him the difference between right and wrong and make sure you're never wronged." George indeed looked like a stern father. However, while he might hate the child's mother, he wouldn't take it out on an innocent kid. He seemed strict but didn't hide his effort and care. The man known for being sparing with words in public spends quite a bit of time and words teaching his child right from wrong in private. George is rational, calm, disciplined, strong, and resilient. That one truth he needs to find feels like a persistent worry for him. To heal, he has to painfully reopen an old wound. Facing this man who's been sharing my bed these past nights. Tonight, with mixed feelings, I managed to find a cold compress for his eyes, leaning in to put it on for him. I even put a black eye mask on him. Even if there's only the slightest chance, I don't want to see George suffer a recurrence of his old injury. I came back from washing up, with some water still on my fingertips. George was still sitting on the edge of the bed, his long, clean fingers resting on the dark bedding. With his eyes covered, he couldn't see me. It made it easier for me to closely observe him. He used to be the older brother who needed to set an example for me. The CEO who acted calmly for his company. A strict father. And now, a husband within my reach. I couldn't resist gently touching his face, lingering on his jawline. Memories of our closeness and interaction these past 2 months now flood my mind, and I need to confirm something. "George, have you started to like me?" I feared I'd never get to hear the answer again. Instead of answering directly, he lowered his head and bit one of my fingers. My cool and wet finger touched inside his mouth. Then he willingly wrapped his tongue around it, warm and moist. His demeanor remained composed and cool, much like when he spoke at the office. With a whisper as he touched my finger, he said, "Savor me." Only after a while did George quietly say, "Of course I like you, honey." Sunday night was the group's mid-year anniversary celebration, held at one of its luxury hotels. The CEO, George, who was supposed to attend, wasn't at the event tonight. In contrast to the lively event, it was incredibly quiet at sea. On the yacht, I was still wearing the champagne pink evening gown from the party, feeling lightheaded. When the private detective came to me, I realized that hiding it from George any longer, beyond 5 years, was impossible. I asked if they knew my real identity. Someone said, "George's wife." We were surprised when we found out during our investigation. No one expected the person he supposedly loathed for years would also be his lover. Getting stuff done with money, even if it might totally mess up your and George's current peaceful lives. This outcome still has to be handed to George. Once I chose to return home, I stopped trying to avoid reality and thought about how to make them, father and son, meet. But I never expected George to hate Evan's biological mother to the point of wanting her completely gone. I lost the courage to be honest, afraid that everything I have now would become just a fleeting firework in the sky. I could never bring myself to let our love turn into hate. George has to come tonight to solve this mystery himself. The cabin door opens, and the approaching footsteps are steady. I lean weakly on the chair, wrapped in a black cloak, the hood covering my face. Until George stops. He lowers his eyes, looking coldly at the woman before him. Seeing her form tremble, like she just realized she's scared. The man doesn't want to waste time. He speaks simply and directly. "My life, George's path, doesn't need you to alter it. This is a provocation. I won't kill you." George now has a wife and child, not likely to take reckless risks. He says lightly. "But living can be far scarier than dying, right?" He will make the other person taste their life being completely turned upside down. Outside, the sea roars, tonight's ocean seeming like a vast abyss. It makes the woman appear too quiet. George's face is calm, yet he raises his finger. He also needs to solve the puzzle, bringing clarity to confusing issues. But George doesn't yet know that his love and resentment are clashing together. He reaches for the brim of the hat covering her face. The black cloak slips away, revealing a slender figure. And a face George knows all too well. He, usually calm in handling things, shows unprecedented shock. "Joanna?" George pulls out his phone to check if there's been some mistake. But I can't avoid it anymore. I grab his sleeve. "What you see is the truth." "How old were you then?" George finally speaks again after a long pause. "Did I not teach you how a girl should protect herself?" I have never seen George with such a displeased expression. "What stage were you at to end up pregnant?" "I was at the Whites, and Mom wouldn't have been strict with me. When I was just entering college, George gave me a CD. He was cool and reserved then, not directly saying what it was. I found out it contained extremely detailed physiological knowledge. We were in different cities for college. He, as an older brother, had the right to tell me to always protect myself from men. Not to be easily swayed by guys at school. Considering our past, do you find the relationship we had disgusting?" Knowing what he's wondering about, I got sick afterward, took medicine but just threw it all up. "What do you want me to do?" "Yes, Evan's birth disrupted your life back then. Low blood sugar and seasickness, I wasn't in good shape at all. I fainted the next moment. When I woke up, I wasn't on the boat anymore, lying in a double bed in a bedroom at a house. Seeing George looking angry, a rare sight. I thought when I next opened my eyes, I'd be shipped off to North or South America or somewhere. A phone call wakes me up. It's 3 or 4 in the morning. I've started calling since getting married. I answer, calling, Mom. George's mom says, "Joanna, George came by at midnight to ask if we pressured you. He knows everything. I've never seen him this mad at me. I'm afraid he'll take it out on you." Maybe you should take Evan abroad for vacation, avoid him for a while. I didn't go abroad, and I didn't hide from him either. In the new week at the company meeting, George is still in the main seat. He seems a bit indifferent today, though still properly wearing a three-piece suit, sitting in a chair. If you looked closely, you'd see the tiredness under his eyes. His usual watch and tie clip are absent today. When we accidentally lock eyes, I pause a bit in my speech during the meeting. He didn't come home the whole night. Is this our first Cold War after an argument? George is always quiet and reserved. I'm usually mild-tempered too. He's always been mature and tolerant with me. Never thought we'd end up in an argument one day, even if just a few words. Just as the meeting ends, something happens as I'm about to leave. Not noticing, a male colleague knocks his elbow against my lower back while putting away his laptop. The force was strong, and I stagger forward, hitting my waist hard on a sharp table corner. It hurt so bad that cold sweat broke out on me, and I knelt on the floor. The colleague pales, trying to help me up. Move aside. It's George's voice. The beige French shirt has bloodstains. George's expression isn't good, swiftly taking off the coat to wrap around me. Covering with the coat, he squats down, lifting my shirt to check my injury. The waist is such a fragile place. George quickly checks the injury, taking a clean handkerchief from an assistant to press the wound and stop the bleeding. He holds my legs, lifting me in front of everyone. Hospital. Luckily, no bone or internal injuries, but George arranges a hospital stay. The nurse comes in for dressing the wound, followed by a masked female doctor. I don't pay attention to who it is at first. George is also in the room. The nurse attempts to ask him to leave. George calmly says, "I'm her husband." As I lift my hospital gown, his eyes fall openly on my exposed waist. His brow furrows, and he steps out of the room. The female doctor follows, and I hear the conversation outside. I observed earlier. It's best you avoid eye strain. Since you've had surgery before, if symptoms arise, why not get a professional checkup at the department? I just found out it was Linda. George's tone was colder than that day, and he was more straightforward, saying, "Miss Linda, I'm married now. It's not like I'm the only guy in the world." George went out for about 10 minutes, didn't stay out too long, then quickly came back. Now it was just the two of us in the hospital room. From his conversation with others, I still caught the undertone. He hadn't thought about divorce. George came over and half squatted in front of my bed, and I thought he was going to continue settling scores with me. But George actually said, "I'm sorry, Joanna. It was me being not a good person at the time, not you doing anything wrong. I said a lot of BS, you don't need to be afraid. If it were anyone else, I'd want them to pay the price. But if it's you, I can't help but have double standards. I just feel it was my fault." George quietly confessed, explaining bit by bit. At that moment, all I could think about was that you shouldn't have to suffer so early just because of me. That's why I questioned you, got angry and scolded you. It wasn't my intention to take it out on you, and I never thought it was disgusting. He finally asked me, "You were young and alone back then, was it really tough?" I didn't answer directly. A lot of intense emotions seemed beyond words. "I kind of want to kiss you right now." I leaned back against the pillow, and George leaned over to gently touch my lips. He carefully avoided the injuries on my body, getting closer to my chest. I could hear our hearts beating in sync. Feeling that a light kiss wasn't enough, I took the initiative for once. I slipped my tongue in, even using a bit of technique, yet I didn't make him open his teeth. I couldn't hold back and asked, "Why?" George finally told me, "I just went out to smoke a cigarette." Explaining, occasional smoke. I was startled he still had that habit and finally said, "It's okay." He then opened his lips and engaged directly. I couldn't really smell the smoke anymore. It was more of a fresh mint flavor, faintly sweet. Why would someone seasick and scared still want to board the ship? If that's your struggle, even though I'm scared, I'd want to help you escape. While George was gently pressing against me, kissing, someone pushed open the hospital room door. It was George's mom, bringing Evan along. She seemed visibly surprised to see us. Caught by a kid in a moment of adult intimacy, George, being a father, casually withdrew, resuming his public demeanor. Luckily, it was just a kiss. When Mom left after visiting, George asked her to leave Evan behind. Evan came to my bedside alone, and I asked him, "You want to check on me, right?" He said, "I heard your tummy bled. I thought you lost your little baby." I told him bluntly, "Your dad and I won't be having another child. Because we haven't loved you enough yet." His eyes widened a bit. Evan is just a 5-year-old kid, even if he's smart, the words miscarriage are kinda over his head. I still asked him, "How do you understand that a bleeding tummy means losing a baby?" He replied, "Vivian told me, her mom lost her little brother once after getting hurt." Is that why you want to protect them? A kid taught and raised by George isn't gonna be bad. Evan is clearly the kindest little kid. When I saw Linda in the hospital again, I told her, "Why don't I help you?" Although I work in corporate legal stuff, I'm a qualified lawyer and can take personal cases. There should be zero tolerance for violence. As a professional, I also hope the laws keep getting better so the weak have something to rely on. George was right. What really helps Linda is the law, putting those scumbags behind bars. I originally didn't quite understand why Linda hadn't sought a lawyer before. Once my injuries got a bit better, I accompanied her to the assessment center, and after returning, we organized the documents at a cafe near the hospital. When we went out, the sky was pretty dark, and a few men stood across the street casually looking our way. Linda didn't look too good and told me, "Joanna, you should go first. Anyone trying to help me get scared off or threatened by my ex-husband." I also noticed something was off as they started heading our way. Just when it got really dangerous, 2 cars suddenly stopped by the road. George got out of the front Bentley, looking like he descended from the heavens. Several well-trained bodyguards stepped out from the back car. It wasn't that far. George was in a suit but almost rushed over. He personally kicked down the one closest to us, placing his hand at my waist. His hand was broad, highlighting the size difference, basically securing half my waist, half embracing me. George's hair was slightly messy. He asked me, "Are you all right?" The guy George kicked down suddenly got up again, thrashing toward Linda. "Now you're pretty bold." George and I were closest to her and saw Linda about to get hit. George let go of me, stepped forward, and reached out, viciously gripping that man's wrist. Stopping the punch aimed just inches from Linda. George made the call for police action. He got a scratch on his hand, treated at the hospital. Linda thanked George, "Thanks for stepping in to help me." George didn't even look up, "No need to thank me. Thank my wife. It's my duty as her husband. I help you because she wouldn't want you to be hurt again." Linda still had something to say. "I just wanted your help. I never intended to ruin your family. But I did regret and wondered if I hadn't been as proud back then, more determined, would things be different now? Your mother actually dismissed me back then. George, I just want an answer from those days, if I had been more determined." I heard it all. Actually, I also have a budding thought, wanting to hear the answer from back then. It seemed George finally noticed my curiosity. He turned to Linda and said, "I have plenty of material wealth, my parents raised me well, and I'm rich in spirit. I have my own strong and determined will. So why do you think just because you were there when I was sick, you'd be my salvation and light? You offer things I don't lack. I'm not moved or touched by that. Dr. Linda, I appreciate your help during the surgery as my doctor, but I've paid the full surgery fee. Even though you were admired by many back in the day, I admit you have admirable qualities, but I'm not attracted. Once I left the hospital, you became just a passerby to me." George never liked Linda. Liking someone wasn't that simple for him. The person he loved was someone he'd nurtured for years with care, someone he'd waited patiently for before finally, carefully touching that fragrant petal. Tonight was my last night in the hospital. He slept beside me on the same bed. I said to him, saying the word husband gives me such a sense of security. Then I asked George, did you always have feelings for me? I got his reply, yes. Even someone like him, the best of his class, had moments of self-doubt where he felt unworthy, saying things he didn't mean. I returned to work at the company. That night on the water felt like it peeled back the calm surface between us, revealing the turmoil below, only to magically settle back down. I never expected things to resolve so easily. It was like any strong dislike George once had instantly turned to nothing when he realized it was me dissolving into nothingness. Even after reflecting on it all, George felt like his life had finally cleared up. He changed. He used to keep his emotions hidden, but now you could see he was in a good mood. One day, he directly picked me up and carried me out of the meeting room where many could see. People are bound to gossip when the married CEO is so close with a female employee. Before any rumors could spread, George went public with our wedding photos. In such a big company, of course, there are still some odd voices. This time, I overheard some chatter while returning to my department after a meeting with the manager. George, leaving early for once, came with me. Neither of us could ignore what was being said. It was two colleagues I usually got along with. One said, she got a promotion just 2 months after starting here. Turns out she's the CEO's wife, flown in as a trophy. The other added, the title CEO's wife sounds good, but really she's just a young stepmom. I heard it's because she's close to Joanna, who forced George to marry her. George's face noticeably cooled. He interrupted them, not caring that they didn't even notice us coming. If a man can't decide on his own marriage, that's his failure, he declared, making them startle. I'll only marry someone I love, and she's the mother of my child. She didn't need to prioritize family and kids over everything. I'm fair to all of you at work, but I'll favor my wife in life over you. George was firm, not backing down. I don't want to hear such talk again. Picking Evan up from kindergarten reminded me, how should I tell him I'm his mom? George said, I'll help you with that. Being with George often shows me that a good relationship can be a source of strength, a refuge for each other. I took Evan to the convenience store. Looking at the snacks on the counter, he asked, Dad never lets me eat these. Can I have them today? I whispered to him, your dad used to come here for grilled fish balls and takoyaki, though I ate them all in the end. I leaned close to Evan's ear and said, your dad isn't as strict as you think. The games you play now, he's beaten them all. I turned and saw George standing behind us. Standing upright, I smiled at George, saying, sorry, seems like I ruined your image as a strict dad today. The grilled fish balls were spicier than I remembered. George had his assistant take Evan to the car first and then kissed me in front of everyone. Feel better now? I got nervous telling Evan the truth that night. After hearing it, he was pensive for a while. So, you left me for 5 years, right? I think George once said something very true at work. Baby, it's not about leaving you. It's that your mom needed to choose her own path in life, too. That's how I grew during those 5 years, because if my life from 21 revolved only around one child, I might have ended up just a bird in George's cage. It was all because George turned down Joanna's proposal all those years ago and didn't keep me by his side when I was 20. Instead, I got to polish my own feathers in return, bringing back his hopes with me. When we won Linda's lawsuit, it was deep winter. Her new life could finally begin. Whenever I interacted with her as an eye doctor, I couldn't help but think about George's eye issues. Thankfully, he'd always taken it seriously. After a check by Linda's mentor, we had no need to worry anymore. Before we got the results, George, a little tense, asked me, but what if? I asked him, do you remember our wedding vows? With his excellent memory, he recited them with me. To understand, love one another, support each other for life. Whether youthful or old, weathering every storm together as lifelong partners. We believe in those vows. We are committed to keeping them.